The blizzard wasn't just cold, it was alive, roaring through the Montana mountains like a beast that swallowed sound itself. Inside a lonely cabin, Ethan Walker, a retired Navy SEAL, thought his battles were long over, until his old K9, Rex, lifted his head and began to growl, low, steady, and certain. Ethan opened the door and stepped into the storm. Through the white haze he found her, a little girl, barely 8, frozen and trembling beneath a fallen pine. He carried her back, wrapped her in blankets, and when her eyes finally opened, she whispered, "My mom said you'd find me." He had never met her mother. But that night, Ethan realized this child wasn't lost. She was sent, and the secret she carried would break him before it saved him. This is a story about courage, loyalty, and the light that still burns beneath the coldest ashes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And if you believe that even in the darkest storms, there are still hearts brave enough to guide us home, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of faith, bravery, and the quiet miracles that refuse to die. The wind came first, sliding down the jagged ridges of the Montana mountains, twisting the snow into a solid wall of white. The storm erased the horizon until even the pines became ghosts. Inside a small wooden cabin by a frozen lake, a fire flickered weakly in the hearth. Ethan Walker sat in its glow, his broad shoulders hunched, hands wrapped around a chipped metal mug that smelled faintly of whiskey and ash. He was in his early 40s, the kind of man carved by discipline and silence. Square jaw hidden behind a few days of dark stubble, short brown hair flecked with early gray, and eyes the color of winter steel. His face bore the small, uneven scars that never quite fade from war. Once he had been a Navy SEAL, the kind of soldier who moved through gunfire like it was weather. Now he was just a man counting his days by the sound of the wind and the crack of wood in the fire. On the rug before the fire lay Rex, his German shepherd, a magnificent animal of deep sable and tan. 9 years old, strong despite the silver in his coat. Rex had been trained for combat, obedient, intelligent, a creature who once lived for command and danger. In retirement, he had learned something harder: stillness. But that night, even the calm in him began to break. His ears twitched first, then his body stiffened. A low growl rumbled from his chest, deep and certain. Ethan looked up. "Easy, boy," he muttered, voice hoarse from disuse. He listened, only the whistle of the wind through the eaves. He wanted to believe it was nothing. But Rex's growl deepened. The dog rose, tail rigid, eyes fixed on the back window that faced the endless whiteness of the forest. Then came a sound that cut through the storm, the long, rising howl of a trained K9 detecting life. It wasn't a warning. It was a plea. "God damn it," Ethan whispered. He shoved aside the mug, pulled on his heavy field jacket and snow boots. The old instincts, buried under months of solitude, snapped awake. He grabbed the flashlight and the emergency beacon, then opened the door. The storm slammed into him like a wave. Snow tore across his face, freezing his breath. "Rex, find!" he shouted. The command, crisp and familiar, sliced through the wind. Rex bounded into the blizzard, vanishing into the white. Ethan followed, head bowed, boots crunching through drifts that reached his knees. The light from his flashlight was useless, a small cone swallowed by chaos. He moved by faith, by the faint shadow of Rex's form flickering ahead between gusts of snow. Minutes or hours passed in that frozen void. Then, through the roar, came a bark, sharp and frantic. Ethan pushed toward it, lungs burning. He stumbled through a grove of snow-buried pines and saw Rex digging wildly beneath one of them, snow flying in frantic bursts. Ethan dropped to his knees beside him, scraping with his gloved hands until the beam of his flashlight struck something soft. Fabric. It was a small shape curled into film itself, wrapped in a torn pink blanket stiff with ice. A child. Her hair was tangled with frost, strands of light brown plastered against her face. Her skin was blue-white, lips trembling but moving, whispering something he couldn't hear. Ethan tore off his gloves and pressed 2 fingers against her neck. Weak pulse. She was alive. He gathered her into his arms, feeling how feather-light she was beneath the frozen layers. The child's body jerked faintly, and her cracked lips formed words between shallow breaths. "My mom," she said. "You'd find me." Ethan froze. For a heartbeat, the storm went silent in his head. "You'd find me." He looked at her face, maybe 8 years old, cheeks hollowed by cold, eyes half-lidded and glazed with fear. There was something hauntingly familiar in her voice, but he couldn't place it. He didn't have time to think. "Hang on, kid. We're going home." He pulled her close to his chest and turned back into the storm. Rex stayed tight at his side, barking once, then forging a path ahead. Each step was a battle, wind howling, snow lashing his face, but Ethan kept going. His muscles screamed, the cold biting through layers of fabric, but the small heartbeat against his chest kept him moving. He wasn't saving a stranger. He was fighting something older, a memory of all the ones he hadn't saved before. By the time he stumbled back to the cabin, his legs were numb. He kicked the door shut behind him, collapsing to his knees beside the fire. The child's skin was waxy and cold. "Don't you die on me," he muttered, voice breaking. He stripped off her soaked blanket and wrapped her in the thick wool one from his cot. Rex curled close, pressing his warm body against her side, instinctively shielding her from the air. Minutes passed. The girl's breathing steadied, shallow but real. Ethan rubbed her arms, whispering without thinking, words that came from the part of him that once whispered to brothers bleeding in the dark. "You're safe now, kid. You hear me? You're safe." The fire hissed. Somewhere outside, the storm raged harder, as if furious to have lost one of its own. Ethan sat back, staring at the tiny figure before him. A little girl in a world that had no business sparing her. He touched the edge of her blanket gently. "Who the hell are you?" Rex lifted his head, amber eyes meeting Ethan's, as if to answer. "Someone we were meant to find." And in that quiet, Ethan felt it. The pull of something larger than the storm, something that whispered this was no coincidence. This was a message. A new mission had begun, one that had nothing to do with orders or medals. Outside, the wind howled again, less like rage, more like a cry for the dead. The storm had quieted to a whisper by dawn, a cold gray light pressing against the frosted windows of the cabin. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers, filling the room with the faint smell of pine smoke and melted wax. Ethan Walker, a man whose body still bore the posture of discipline even in exhaustion, sat slouched beside the hearth. His square jaw was shadowed by stubble, and his blue-gray eyes, eyes that once scanned deserts for enemies, now watched the small figure lying near the fire. He had spent hours feeding her sips of warm water and rubbing life back into her fingers, and now, as the sun tried to push through the fog, The girl began to stir. Her breath caught, her thin chest rising sharply. When her eyes opened, they were not the soft eyes of a child waking from sleep. They were wild, frightened, the eyes of someone who had run too far from home. She scrambled backward, the wool blanket slipping from her shoulders, pressing herself against the log wall as if every corner of the cabin were a trap. Rex, the 9-year-old German shepherd, lifted his head from his paws and watched her carefully. His coat glowed amber in the firelight, and though his presence was large, there was patience in the way he didn't move. His tail flicked once, slow and calm, and his brown eyes seemed to say, "You're safe." Ethan raised both hands, palms open. "It's okay, kid. You're not in danger here." His voice was deep, steady, the voice of a man who had given orders on battlefields, now trying to remember how to comfort. She stared at him, trembling, her tangled brown hair framing a face too pale for her age. "Where's my mom?" she whispered. Ethan hesitated. "You were alone when I found you," he said gently. "Do you remember what happened?" The girl swallowed hard. Her voice came haltingly, each word breaking like ice underfoot. "She told me to run. She said if she didn't come back, I should find a man named Ethan Walker and his dog Rex." She turned her gaze toward the animal, almost afraid to believe it. "That's you, isn't it?" The words hit him like shrapnel. Ethan leaned back slightly, his heartbeat thudding in his chest. He hadn't heard that name, Amelia Grant, in almost a decade, yet her voice still lived somewhere deep in his memory. Back in Afghanistan, during his last deployment, there had been an operation that went wrong, a convoy of civilians trapped in crossfire. He had disobeyed orders to pull them out. Amelia had been there, clutching her daughter, barely escaping alive. Afterward, she sent him a letter written in careful handwriting. "You didn't just save our lives. You gave me a reason to believe good men still exist." Ethan had kept that letter folded in his Bible long after Faith had left him. He forced his voice to steady. "Your mom. She's Amelia, isn't she?" Lila nodded. "She said a man named Richard found out what she knew. She said he used to be her friend. But when he smiled, his eyes were cold." The child's voice cracked. "She said if she told the truth, he'd make her disappear." Ethan's fists tightened on his knees. Richard Thorne. The name was familiar. A businessman turned political donor, smiling in news headlines, shaking hands with senators who never looked too closely. Ethan had heard rumors about him in the veteran circles, whispers about charity funds that vanished into shell companies. He remembered Amelia's soft-spoken courage, how she looked even then like someone too kind for the ugliness of men like that. "Your mom was right to run," he said quietly. "And she was right to send you here." He glanced at Rex, who had moved closer to the girl, resting his head on her lap. She flinched at first, then slowly placed her hand on his fur. It was thick and warm beneath her fingers. Rex closed his eyes, letting her touch ground him, the way soldiers used to rest their hands on his neck before stepping into chaos. Ethan turned toward the corner of the room where the old radio sat on the desk, its dials dusty, the wire antenna bent from years of neglect. "We'll call for help," he said, forcing hope into his tone. He switched it on. Static filled the cabin, rising and falling like the sea. "Mayday, Mayday," he spoke into the microphone, his voice cutting through the static. "This is Ethan Walker, coordinates North Ridge by Glacier Bay. I've got a child in need of medical evac. Nothing but crackle. The storm had swallowed the airwaves. He tried again, slower, adjusting the dials, each movement deliberate, as if care alone could summon rescue. Still nothing. He turned the radio off, the silence that followed somehow louder than the storm. Lila was watching him. "No one's coming, are they?" she asked softly. Ethan met her gaze. There was fear there, but also something he recognized, the quiet endurance of someone who had already lost too much. "Someone will," he said, though he wasn't sure who he meant. He drew in a long breath, looking at the snow thick against the window. The storm had cut them off completely. He set another log on the fire. The flames caught, painting his face in orange light. The warmth didn't reach the hollow in his chest. He could feel Amelia's ghost in the room, not as something supernatural, but as the weight of every choice he had ever made. She had trusted him once, and now her child was sitting in his cabin because of it. Ethan looked at Lila again. "You did good, kid," he said quietly. "You made it here. That took courage." She didn't reply, but the smallest flicker of relief passed through her eyes. She leaned her head against Rex's neck, and for the first time her breathing began to even out. The dog stayed still, steady as stone, a living wall between her and the world. As the night thickened outside, Ethan felt the weight of purpose settling on him again. He had spent years trying to forget what it felt like to matter. Now, in the silence between the howling wind, he knew that forgetting was over. Somewhere out there, a man named Richard Thorne was hunting this child's mother, or had already found her. And if Amelia was gone, this girl was the only truth left. He poured a small measure of whiskey into a tin cup and set it beside the fire without touching it. The habit remained, a soldier's ritual for the fallen. "Rest, Lila," he murmured, the name tasting strange and new on his tongue. "We'll figure this out when the storm breaks." Rex raised his head once, listening to the wind. Ethan met the dog's gaze. They both understood what the silence outside meant. It wasn't peace. It was the pause before something worse. And as the last ember flared, Ethan realized the war he'd been running from had found him again. Only this time, the battlefield was his own home, and the life at stake was the last one he could still save. The storm had finally begun to die. The sky above the Montana wilderness was a bruised gray, heavy and slow, the kind of silence that comes only after nature has screamed itself hoarse. The world lay buried under a thick white shroud. Pine branches drooped with the weight of ice, and the frozen lake below the ridge reflected a dull, metallic light. Ethan Walker stood outside his cabin, the snow crunching beneath his boots, his breath forming thin clouds in the brittle air. He looked every inch the man the world had forgotten, broad-shouldered, weathered, and solemn, the lines on his face carved deep by years of war and isolation. His beard had grown coarse in the weeks of storm, and his eyes, gray as the lake, had the watchful stillness of someone who had seen too much to ever fully rest again. Beside him trotted Rex, the German shepherd who had been his shadow since the service. 9 years old, but still built like a machine of muscle and purpose. The dog's fur was thick with snow, and his breath steamed as he scanned the tree line. To strangers, Rex looked intimidating, a soldier's dog through and through. But Ethan knew every twitch of that scarred ear, every flick of that intelligent gaze. Rex was his conscience when reason failed, and right now, The dog's body was taut, alert to something in the air. Ethan adjusted the strap of his rifle and looked back at the cabin. Inside, little Lila Grant was asleep by the fire, her small frame swallowed by his old navy blanket. She'd fought a fever through the night, clutching Rex's toy, a chewed leather ball, as if it were a talisman. He had promised her he'd find her mother. He wasn't sure if that was a lie yet, but it was the kind of lie a soldier tells to keep a child's heartbeat steady. Now, as the wind stilled, it was time to keep that promise. He gave a low whistle. "Rex, track." The dog lowered his nose, sniffing along the snow, and began moving downhill through the pines. Ethan followed, boots crunching rhythmically behind. Every few steps, he scanned the horizon, the muscle memory of reconnaissance still wired into his nerves. Somewhere deep inside, that familiar current of adrenaline hummed again. Not the kind that came from fear, but the dangerous calm before violence. They descended into a narrow ravine where the snow turned to ice, slick and blue in the shadows. The wind funneled through the rocks with a hollow moan. Then Rex stopped. His tail stiffened, head tilting sharply. Ethan crouched beside him and followed the dog's gaze. There, half buried beneath a mound of snow and branches, was a shape that didn't belong to the wilderness. The upturned frame of a pickup truck. Ethan's gut clenched. The windshield was shattered. The hood crumpled against a pine trunk. The tires were still faintly visible, frozen solid. He approached slowly, each step careful, the soldier in him assessing everything. The drag marks, the direction of the skid, the absence of footprints leaving the site. The accident was no accident. He brushed snow from the driver's side door, revealing dark smears frozen against the metal. Blood. "Damn it," he muttered. He wrenched the door open. It groaned, reluctant, and inside the cab lay the chaos of a life interrupted. A woman's scarf tangled in the gear shift, a cracked phone, shattered glass glittering like ice shards. On the passenger seat, a manila folder stained with something deep red. Ethan reached for it, fingers numb, and flipped it open. Inside were photos, printed headshots of Richard Thorne shaking hands with city officials, campaign banners, smiling poses at charity events. But beneath those, pages of financial ledgers, spreadsheets, and falsified signatures. He recognized one of the names stamped repeatedly across them. Veteran Relief and Reconstruction Fund. Ethan's throat tightened. It was supposed to be the program that helped rebuild homes for disabled soldiers. He had volunteered there once, before he'd realized how little of that money ever reached the men who needed it. He turned the last page. A line of handwriting in faded ink, hurried but unmistakable. If you're reading this, they know. Don't trust the sheriff. Don't trust anyone tied to Thorne. It was Amelia's handwriting. Ethan's jaw locked. The wind hissed softly through the wreck, almost like a whisper. He looked up at Rex, who was sitting now, eyes trained on him, waiting. "She found something she wasn't supposed to," Ethan said quietly. "And they made sure she couldn't tell anyone." The words hung in the frozen air like ghosts. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the blood-spattered papers. Then he folded the folder under his arm. "Let's go, boy." The trek back to the cabin was slower, heavier. The sky had begun to darken again, the first flakes of a new storm drifting down. By the time they reached the ridge, Ethan's instincts began to itch. That old sixth sense that had saved his life more than once. Something was wrong. Rex caught it first. The dog stopped dead at the tree line, ears perked, tail low. Then Ethan saw it too. Tire tracks leading straight to the cabin. 2 sets, fresh and wide. No one should have been able to drive up here. The snow was too deep, the roads buried. He dropped the folder into the snow and unshouldered his rifle, heart thudding in his throat. His mind ran through possibilities. Rescue? No. Too clean. Too deliberate. He crept up the porch steps, Rex at his heel, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The door was ajar, a thin strip of darkness between wood and frame. Ethan nudged it open slowly, his breath fogging in the dim light. The fire had burned low, the cabin lit only by its last dying embers. Lila's blanket lay folded on the couch, untouched. Silence pressed in, thick and unnatural. Then a voice broke it. "You were hard to find, Walker." Ethan froze. The voice came from the far corner, smooth and cold as a knife's edge. Out of the shadows stepped Richard Thorne, tall, immaculately dressed, even in the wilderness. His black wool coat fell perfectly to his knees, the kind of coat bought by men who never walked anywhere they didn't own. His hair, dark and neatly combed, framed a face too handsome to be humanly warm. Angular jaw, perfect smile, eyes like 2 chips of ice. He held a pistol lazily in one hand, as if it were a casual accessory. "Mr. Thorne," Ethan said, his voice low. Richard smirked. "You still play the soldier, I see. Even out here. Shame about your discharge. Honorable, wasn't it? They never tell you that being a hero doesn't pay the bills." He took a step closer, the gun catching the firelight. "You should have stayed gone, Walker. But instead, you chose to interfere." Ethan's pulse slowed, his old training taking over. "What did you do to her?" he asked. Richard's smile didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "Amelia made a mistake. Now you're about to make the same one." The hammer of the pistol clicked back. Rex growled, low and steady, the same sound that had started all of this. The storm outside began to rise again, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. And in that frozen moment, Ethan knew the blizzard wasn't done. The worst of it had just walked through his door. The night tore itself apart. The wind screamed through the Montana pines, flinging snow like shards of glass against the windows of the cabin. Inside, the fire burned in wild flashes, painting the walls in red and gold, as if the room itself were bleeding light. Ethan Walker stood between that light and the darkness at the door. His face pale beneath days of beard, his breathing steady, trained. The Navy SEAL in him had awakened completely now, and the quiet man who had once hidden in this cabin was gone. In his place stood a soldier ready for one last fight. His eyes, steel gray and cold, locked on Richard Thorne, the man whose presence turned the air to ice. Richard sat in the armchair as if he owned the room, one leg crossed casually over the other. His black wool coat, soaked from snow, still held its shape, and his hair, dark, slicked back, gleamed under the flickering firelight. The pistol in his gloved hand was steady, almost elegant, as though it belonged there. His face, cut from angles and arrogance, bore that faint smile that never reached his eyes. "You've always been predictable, Walker," he said, his tone smooth as polished marble. "You mistake loyalty for purpose. That's what makes men like you so easy to break." Ethan's pulse thudded behind his ribs, but his voice was calm. "You killed her, Amelia. You killed her because she tried to stop you." Richard's smile tightened. "She forgot her place. She thought truth mattered more than money. A fatal misunderstanding. He raised the pistol slightly, its muzzle glinting. Now you've taken in her daughter, which means you've inherited her problems. And I don't like loose ends. Ethan's gaze flicked for half a heartbeat to the left. The shadow near the back hallway where Lila Grant hid, crouched low, clutching Rex's collar. He couldn't see her, but he knew she was listening, trembling. The thought twisted in his gut. She was a child, yet her eyes already carried the haunted look of someone who'd seen what evil looked like up close. He needed to buy her time. "You talk too much for a man holding a gun," Ethan said dryly, shifting his stance a fraction closer to the fire. Richard tilted his head. "You think you're still in control, soldier? You're just a ghost, pretending to fight a war that ended years ago." Ethan's fingers flexed. He remembered a desert, a flash of light, the sound of men screaming, the ambush that ended his team. He'd survived that day only to carry their ghosts home. And now another war had found him, smaller, but just as cruel. "You're right," he said quietly. "But ghosts can still pull the trigger." Before Richard could reply, Ethan slammed his shoulder into the nearest lantern on the mantel. The glass shattered, spilling fire across the floorboards. Flames roared upward, devouring dry wood and shadows alike. Richard cursed and turned instinctively toward the blaze. The one mistake Ethan needed. "Now!" Ethan barked. From the hallway, Rex lunged into the room, a streak of muscle and fury. The German shepherd's teeth found Richard's gun hand, clamping down with a snarl that tore through the chaos. The pistol went off. A deafening crack. The bullet tore past Ethan's cheek, grazing flesh before splintering into the wooden door behind him. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but he didn't stop. Ethan moved fast, the old instincts rising like muscle memory. He tackled Richard to the ground, the two men crashing into the overturned chair, fists and fury colliding in the storm of fire and snow. Richard fought like a cornered predator, wild, desperate. But Ethan fought with purpose, every strike aimed, every motion honed by years of discipline. The smell of smoke and blood mingled in the air, thick and choking. Richard slammed an elbow into Ethan's ribs, knocking the wind from him, and rolled free, grabbing the fallen pistol with his left hand. He aimed, but Rex was faster. The dog launched again, teeth sinking deep into Richard's forearm. The gun fired once more, the shot going wide, shattering a jar of kerosene on the counter. Fire leapt greedily toward the curtains. "Rex, out!" Ethan shouted. The dog obeyed instantly, releasing his hold and retreating toward the door, herding Lila behind him. Ethan grabbed the edge of the desk and swung it hard, slamming Richard backward into the wall. The pistol clattered across the floor, spinning to a stop near the doorway. Richard gasped, blood running down his sleeve. "You think you've won?" he snarled. "You don't even know what you're standing against." Ethan's face was streaked with soot and blood. "I don't need to know," he said, breathing hard. "I just need to end you." Richard's boot connected with Ethan's leg, and in that brief stumble, he bolted, crashing through the back door into the blizzard beyond. "Don't let him get away!" Lila's voice rang out, shrill and terrified. Ethan grabbed his jacket, ignoring the sting on his cheek. "Stay inside. Rex, with me." The door slammed open, and the two vanished into the storm. The night howled around them, snow lashing like knives against their faces. Ethan's breath came in ragged bursts as he followed the footprints cutting across the fresh snow, illuminated by the faint light spilling from the burning cabin. Ahead, a dark shape stumbled across the frozen lake. Richard, clutching his arm, half limping, half running. Ethan slowed only enough to raise his weapon. "Stop!" he shouted over the wind. Richard turned, his face ghostly pale under the stormlight, a pistol shaking in his hand. "You can't stop this, Walker! You can't kill what owns this town!" "Maybe not," Ethan said, his voice low, steady. "But I can kill you." He took a step forward. The ice groaned beneath them. Richard's wild eyes darted downward. Too late. A deep crack split the silence, running like lightning across the lake. The surface gave way beneath Richard's boots. He screamed as the ice shattered and the black water swallowed him whole. His gun slipped from his grasp, vanishing into the abyss with him. Ethan stopped at the edge, chest heaving, snow clinging to his hair and lashes. He stared down into the dark hole, where the current pulled the last trace of the man below. His reflection flickered in the water, scarred, older, but alive. "War's over, Richard," he murmured, voice barely a breath. "You just never learned how to stop fighting." The wind carried the words away. Rex pressed against his leg, whining softly. Behind them, the cabin burned, its flames standing defiant against the storm. Ethan turned back, the glow lighting his face like dawn breaking through ash. For the first time in years, he felt the faint pulse of peace, fragile, uncertain, but real. By the time the storm had surrendered to silence, the world outside the cabin no longer looked like the same one that had swallowed it days ago. The Montana mountains stretched wide and white under a pale sky, the first sunlight of spring pressing faintly through the fog. The lake, once cracked and cruel, now shimmered with thin mirrors of melting ice. Ethan Walker stood at the edge of his porch, his figure a dark outline against the soft brightness. His broad frame carried the stiffness of a soldier who still couldn't unclench from battle. Snow clung to the folds of his weathered jacket, his beard thicker now, his face marked with healing cuts from the fight that had nearly cost him his life. In his eyes lingered something unnameable. Not relief, not triumph, just the quiet ache of a man who had seen too much end and too little begin. Behind him, through the half-open door, the sound of small laughter spilled into the cold air. It was hesitant at first, then freer, the kind of laughter that belonged to someone relearning what it meant to feel safe. Lila Grant, the girl who had once been found frozen beneath a pine tree, now sat cross-legged on the cabin floor, a pencil gripped in her small hand. Her long brown hair had been brushed clean, though it still curled untidily at the ends. The color had returned to her cheeks, faint pink against skin that had once been gray with frostbite. She was drawing on a scrap of brown paper torn from one of Ethan's supply boxes, a child's sketch of a woman with kind eyes holding a dog's paw. Beneath it, in small, uneven letters, she had written, "Mom and Rex." Rex himself lay near the fire, his thick fur gleaming in the glow. 9 years old, the German shepherd carried new scars beneath his coat, trophies from battles both military and recent. His muzzle was graying, but his amber eyes were sharp, alive. The way he watched Lila, patient, protective, always aware, said more than any words could. He had served many masters in his life, but this one, this little girl who whispered secrets to him in the quiet hours, had become the one he guarded most. Ethan turned back inside, the door closing softly behind him. The cabin was warmer than it had been in months. The fire hissed and cracked, the scent of pine resin and smoke filling the air. On the table lay a stack of documents sealed in clear plastic, marked with the crest of the Montana State Police. The officers had come that morning, their vehicles crunching over the slush and gravel, their questions curt but polite. They had confirmed what Ethan already knew. Richard Thorne was dead. The body had been found trapped beneath the lake's ice, preserved by the cold. They took the files, the photos, the ledgers Amelia had risked her life to collect. Ethan gave them everything without hesitation, except one thing. Now, in his hand, he held that missing piece, a small photograph folded along the edges, worn by time and grief. It was Amelia Grant, smiling beneath a summer sky, her arm around a younger Lila. The woman's hair was the color of honey, her expression open, fearless, the same warmth Ethan remembered from a decade ago in Afghanistan, when she had thanked him with tears in her eyes for saving her convoy. She had written him once, "If you ever feel lost, remember, light doesn't die in the dark. It just hides until someone believes in it again." He had forgotten those words until now. He stared at the photo until the firelight made the paper shimmer. "You did it, Amelia," he murmured. "You got her home." Lila looked up from her drawing. "Who's Amelia?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated. "Your mother," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "She was brave. Braver than anyone I've ever known." The girl studied him, her young face serious beyond her years. "She said you'd find me." "I think she sent you," Ethan replied, kneeling beside her. "When people like your mom, when they're gone, sometimes they leave us signs, little reminders that we're not finished yet." He placed the photo beside her drawing. "You and I, we're one of those signs." Outside, the snow was thinning, patches of brown earth showing through. The wind had softened into something almost gentle. Rex stretched, yawned, and padded toward them, laying his head on Lila's knee. She giggled quietly, rubbing his ear. For the first time since Ethan had found her, she didn't flinch at touch or sudden sound. From the hearth, the flames flickered low, casting long orange shadows across the walls. Ethan sat back against his chair, the warmth of the fire washing over him. The ache in his ribs still reminded him of the fight, but he didn't mind. Pain, after all, was proof of survival. He poured a small measure of coffee into a tin cup and stared into it, the reflection of the flames dancing in the dark liquid. "She sent you here for a reason," he said, more to himself than to her. "Maybe to remind me that not all battles are meant to be fought. Some are meant to be lived through." Lila's eyes followed him quietly. "Are we safe now?" He smiled faintly. "Yeah, kid. We're safe." He wasn't sure if it was true, but as he said it, the words felt lighter than before, like they belonged in the air. Hours later, as dusk fell, the cabin glowed against the dimming snow. From a distance, it looked almost like a lantern left in the middle of the wilderness, a small proof of warmth in a world that too often froze everything it touched. Inside, Rex slept by the fire, his chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. Lila's head rested on a pillow near the hearth, her drawing still beside her. Ethan sat awake, staring at the window, watching the faint shimmer of thawing ice on the lake. He whispered softly, as if Amelia could hear him across the silence of death and snow. "You sent her here like a message from God, to remind me that even in war, there's still something worth living for." The wind outside carried his words across the white hills, scattering them like prayer. And when the first stars broke through the clouds, their light fell on 3 figures, a soldier, a child, and a loyal dog, framed against the last breath of winter. In that moment, they were not survivors of war or victims of loss. They were a family the storm had chosen to leave behind, the keepers of a fragile, enduring hope. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or angels. They come quietly, in the shape of a loyal dog who refuses to give up, a child brave enough to survive the storm, or a broken soldier learning that love is stronger than war. Ethan once believed that God had turned his face away from men like him, soldiers who had seen too much darkness. But on that frozen mountain, God didn't speak through lightning or flame. He spoke through a whisper, through a child's hand clutching his sleeve, through the warmth of a German shepherd's breath, through the gentle reminder that no soul is ever truly forgotten. Because faith is not about the battles we win, it's about the hearts we choose to protect when everything else is lost. And maybe that's what God was trying to tell him, that even in the quiet ruins of winter, He still sends light. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that hope can survive any storm, share it with someone who needs a reason to believe again. Comment below where you're watching from, and tell us what miracle you're praying for tonight. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of faith, loyalty, and the small mercies that remind us God still walks beside us, in every sunrise, every heartbeat, and every second chance He gives. May God bless you, protect your home, and fill your life with the quiet miracles that never fade.